All right. Well, first of all, welcome. This is our kind of regular WebAge webinar series that we do on a lot of different topics, and today we're going to be talking about developing web applications with Spring MVC 3. My name is Stuart Smith, and I'm the Java Administration Lead at WebAge Solutions. We're a premier provider of Java Enterprise Spring training. Really have one of the more robust catalogs of independent Java training outside of the vendors, of course. And we also have quite a bit of in-house developed Spring training. One thing that's very great about all of our training, really, I think the Spring training even more than anything, is the Spring training is highly customizable to your training needs. So we can combine different topics, and of course with Spring, which is a very complex platform, there's a lot of different people need different things, so that's really being important. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and contact us. We'll get you going. All right. Just for the talk today, we'll do kind of an overview of Spring MVC. What we'll also do is kind of talk about Spring MVC integration with Tiles and JavaScript, and overview of Spring Webflow. All right, and then we'll kind of wrap up with our offerings. I was thinking about doing a little bit on kind of some of the major changes in Spring 3, because I realize that some people may not be familiar with that, but there's really so much in this webinar that we really won't have time for that kind of stuff. If you do go to our webinars page, we do have a past webinar recorded on there for changes in Spring 3, and you can register for that and view the recorded version of that. So I'd highly recommend that. If you're just coming into Spring 3, you're not familiar with the new stuff with Spring 3. I know that a lot of questions. People will probably have a lot of different questions. You will get an email after the webinar with where to get the slides. That's, of course, the most popular question in our webinars. If you do have any other questions, there's a questions feature to submit them. Don't know if I'll be able to address all of them as we're going through, because we've got a lot of different ground to cover, but I'll address any open questions at the end once we kind of get through everything, so we'll go ahead and do that. All right, so we'll talk about overview of Spring MVC. Just kind of Spring MVC, of course, is the Model View Controller. Model View Controller is a very popular application pattern. Not really specific to Spring, but just applications in general. Right? And Spring has a web application framework called Spring MVC that applies this pattern to writing web applications for Java web applications. So it addresses things like state management, workflow, validation, etc., all the common things that you need to deal with really in a Java web application. All right? One good thing about the Spring MVC framework, very modular. So you can change various components very easily. So you could change how a particular request is handled without impacting the rest of the requests in the web application. You could change the controller code for request handling without changing perhaps the view, the display page of that particular request and everything. So a lot of different things. In past Spring MVC versions, there's a lot of custom Spring classes that you had to implement or extend or something like that. Spring MVC has really gone through a lot of major changes in kind of the Spring 3 version, if you will. Annotations is a key thing that was introduced quite heavily in Spring 3. Spring MVC uses these annotations very heavily, and we'll see various places where these show up. Right? There used to be this controller interface that used to be the parent class of all of your application code. Really, it's deprecated now in favor of these annotations. Right? So if you're thinking about migrating to Spring MVC 3 and you have a previous Spring MVC application, that's one thing that you might have to look at, is how to change those controllers over. And we'll see an example of the Spring MVC controller here in a second. Right? Also, when we talk about configuration files, you'll see a couple examples of configuration files here in a second. There's a MVC namespace for Spring configuration files, kind of to simplify the Spring MVC configuration. Right? So we'll see that in a little bit here as well. Right? Spring MVC itself is kind of part of a larger group of what's kind of the Spring Web modules. These are basically the different pieces of the Spring framework that address various web application tasks that you have to be able to do. There's the Spring Web module that you see here, kind of in this group here. That's kind of the foundation. It's required by everything else, right? The Servlet module is what has Spring MVC, right? So if you're just using Spring MVC, you're not using it with portlet integration, you're not using the strut support, that kind of thing. Basically, you'd only need these first two, right? The reason that's important is one of the things that has changed a lot with Spring 3 is now all of the different classes that are part of the framework are much more modular themselves. Right? It used to be that they were kind of split up into different pieces, but there was one big giant jar file. You drop this big giant jar file in your web application, that was it. Now you include much smaller jar files, and you only include the pieces that you need. Right? So that's important to know. Very common to use things like Maven to grab the right pieces of the Spring framework. On all of our courses, we use Maven to basically include the right stuff for Spring. There are also these portlet and struts modules in this kind of web group, if you will, that you could use for that kind of stuff. But again, if you're only using Spring MVC, you only need the first two, which is the web module, or the web package web module, and the servlet support. Okay. Spring 2.5 was really the first one that kind of broke these into a separate distribution. And now in Spring 3, of course, everything is split into much smaller, more modular jar files. So one thing to keep in mind. We talk about the request flow. Right? So when a request comes in for a Spring MVC applications, what happens? Right? What are the different components that are involved, and what's the sequence of steps that's happening, basically? There are a couple of different things here. Basically, everything that is in gray, dispatcher, servlet, handler, mapping, view resolver, those are all really generally classes that are provided by the Spring MVC framework, and you're simply configuring them with configuration of your Spring MVC application. Not really writing custom Java program code for those kinds of things. Right? Typically, the program code that you're actually going to see, you see we have in blue the controller, and over on the right we have the view. Right? Those are typically the actual code that you're writing for your application. So if you look at this request flow, you can see that all requests come into this central dispatcher servlet. Very common for Java web applications to have everything come through this kind of central processing, if you will. That's a very common pattern. And then basically the dispatcher server has to figure out, well, I see the request. What am I supposed to do with it? Right? How am I supposed to handle that request? And we'll talk about request mapping, or handler mapping, as it's kind of called here. Basically, Spring MVC has to figure out, well, which controller is supposed to get this? Right? And we'll see that. So how do I get to the custom code that you're writing for this controller to tell me how to handle that request? So step 3, that's when really you're getting that. Notice here another common thing that's pretty common in Java Web Application Frameworks is it returns something back to the central processing to tell it, okay, well, what am I supposed to do next? Right? And in the Spring MVC case, this is often called model and view. There's actually a Java class called model and view that we'll see here in a second. And then the dispatcher servlet relies on something external called a view resolver to figure out what to do with that. Right? What view am I supposed to go to? So again, very common thing where we're looking at basically at this point configuration to figure out what view is supposed to be displayed. Of course, once it figures that out, well, that's when it passes it again to your custom code, which is the view itself. This could be JSF page, JSP page, something like that, and that actually displays the results of the request. So again, very common implementation of the MVC pattern. Big difference with Spring MVC is kind of what these things are called and how they're configured. So we'll dive into that just a little bit. And again, notice the only place where you really have custom code, controllers, and views. All right, so very limited. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about configuration because, of course, that's a big thing in kind of getting a Spring MVC application up and running. Big thing here is notice you have the dispatcher servlet, and this is in web.xml. And notice this dispatcher servlet, again, this is not code that you're writing. This is actually provided by the Spring framework. I've left out some of the packages in the middle just to kind of shorten it and make it easier to display, but it's basically the Spring dispatcher servlet that's provided by Spring MVC. Big part of this, of course, is the servlet mapping. Right? The servlet mapping is going to tell really the web application container, right? When you see this particular kind of request URL come in this case we're using .request on the end, but you could use anything. You see that particular pattern forwarded to the dispatcher servlet. Right? So what we're doing here with the wildcard.request is, anything that ends in .request is going to go through dispatcher servlet. And then at that point, really it's not the web application, or it's not the web container that's deciding what to do with that request. At this point, Spring MVC and the dispatcher servlet takes over. So we will see other places where individual requests will be mapped to, what code is going to execute. Because obviously this wildcard, well, we can't map that to 5 different classes at the same time. Right? We've got to map that individual request to individual methods. And we'll see how we do that the Spring MVC way. Right? So this is really the only servlet that you're probably going to have in your Spring MVC application, is really just the dispatcher servlet. All the other configuration generally going to be in Spring configuration files. All right. Now, by default, a dispatcher servlet will look for a Spring configuration file with -servlet.xml on the end, whatever the servlet name is. So in the prior example, the actual servlet name in web.xml was called dispatcher. So this would look for dispatcher-servlet.xml for Spring configuration. If all of your Spring configuration is in that XML file, you don't have to do any other configuration. But it's very common with Spring applications to have multiple configuration files, or perhaps you want to use a different name. So in that case, what you can do is you can put in the web.xml file the configuration of something called a context loader listener. And this context loader listener, again, part of the Spring framework. So it's not code you're writing, it's just code you're configuring. And what you can do is you can set a custom context parameter, and it always has to have this name, context config location, and you give it basically the other files that you want it to load as Spring configuration. So notice here the names are different. It's not dispatcher-servlet.xml, which would have been the default, and there's multiple. Notice there's a comma here that we can separate multiple files with a comma. Right? So these are Spring XML configuration files. So that's how the settings in your web.xml file tell Spring MVC and the dispatcher servlet basically where to look for the rest of your Spring XML configuration. Okay. Even though Spring 3 focuses on annotations quite a bit, generally you'll just about always have at least a minimal XML configuration. So here we'll talk about, what's that minimal XML configuration that you might have for a Spring MVC application, right? It might be as simple as just these lines that you see here. So you see here, this is about 8 lines of XML configuration. That might be it as far as a Spring MVC application. Okay? Notice here you're seeing the MVC namespace for the Spring configuration file. So this simplifies the configuration of using annotations for the request mapping. Okay, so we'll see that quite a bit, and that'll make things a lot simpler. You also see, and this is not really Spring MVC specific, but you see this context component scan entry in the XML configuration. That basically tells Spring itself, not necessarily just Spring MVC, but any Spring component or any Spring application, basically scan the classes, in this case, in this package. So our controller classes we're going to see, the idea is that they would be in this package somewhere. Scan those for annotations. Right? And again, very common in Spring 3 applications nowadays to look for annotations for configuration of some of this stuff. And this is the one line of XML that kind of hooks that in and tells Spring, okay, well, here's where to go scan for those annotations. So here's what you have. One thing that you probably will still have in XML configuration is, notice we have something here called a view resolver. And there are several different types of view resolvers. This is just one example. One that you can use with Spring MVC. It's called internal resource view resolver. Basically internal resource because it's going to look for, in this case, like JSP files that are part of the web application. Of course, very common. So notice here, this is configured as a regular Spring Bean. Right, so if you're familiar with regular Spring XML configuration, this is nothing new, nothing different. Right? You have this class that you have configured. The big thing here is you're setting different properties like prefix and suffix, right? So now later when we see the controller return the view name, what's going to happen is it's going to take that view name, tack this prefix onto it and this suffix onto it, and look for that file, and basically serve up that file if it's there. Right? This is probably some of the simplest view resolver configuration you can do. There are a lot of other options. Like I say, there are other view resolver implementations. You can have multiple ones configured. So maybe you're looking for a file, or you're looking in a properties file that has, you know, view name and file name pairs or something like that. There's a lot of different ways to configure it. The big thing is you need a view resolver to help Spring MVC figure it out. Now, you give me the abstract name of the view, I got to resolve that into something. Figure out how to actually handle that. All right, so that could be it for configuration. Like I say, a little bit in the web.xml, just setting up the dispatcher servlet and what request is going to be mapped to, send this through Spring MVC. Maybe that context config loader, basically it'll load the configuration files you have. This could be it for your Spring MVC XML configuration. Okay? So really pretty simple. And that's one place where Spring MVC 3 is very different, because it does rely on annotations a lot more, which are going to be in the source code, a lot simpler configuration. So hopefully I'll make it a little bit easier if you're used to prior versions of Spring MVC. All right. The heart of Spring MVC is the Spring MVC Controller. All right. This is really where you're writing the Java code that is taking the request that's coming in and doing something with it, and then returning a view. All right. The big thing to look at here, and obviously this is a pretty simple one, is notice in this method, so the method basically is here, there's a line here, return, in this case, model and view. All right. You don't always have to return that type of class. You can return a lot of different things. You can even return just a string for the name of the view to display. In this case, really the reason we're using model and view is not only are we going to return the view name, which is the first parameter in the constructor here for model and view, we're also going to return a message with this key, hello message. Right? And so basically in the view page we'll see here in a second, you'll see where that hello message key is used to display this dynamic message. Right? Notice if you kind of ignore the annotations and just look at the Java code, regular Java class does not need to extend or implement anything. Basically a regular Java method, right? Really the only thing that's Spring specific here is the model and view class is a Spring class. But again, there's ways to write handler methods that don't use Spring specific classes, a little bit more generic with things just like strings or something, or returning maps and that kind of thing. Right? So if you kind of look at just the Java code, right, it's really simple, and it's really not dependent on Spring very much at all. It's really when you start to look at the annotations where you see where Spring MVC is kind of applying its settings to this Java class. Right? The big thing is the controller. Right? The controller annotation here, that's going to get picked up. That's going to get picked up by the Spring MVC annotation configuration. Right? And it basically tells it to to look for these request mapping annotations. Right? The request mapping annotations are going to say how are we going to map the incoming request URLs to individual methods. So if you look here, request mapping, we have /hello, right? So /hello, if we see that request coming in here, and you see here the /hello coming in on the request URL, right? If that comes in, that's going to map to this method. Right? Obviously, in our controllers, we would have a lot more request mapping annotations because we'd have a lot more requests being configured, how to set them up. Right? Another thing that we see here is request param. Request param is optional, and the idea is that if you have a request parameter coming in for the URL, you can map that and have Spring MVC initialize a parameter for the method. Okay. Request param is probably one of the most difficult annotations to figure out because of its location. Notice here we are inside the parentheses for the method. So this method is say hello. This is the actual parameter to the method. It's just a regular string parameter called message, and you have request param annotation right before that parameter. So it's the location of that annotation. It's a little bit hard to figure out. All right. So that's what you have. All right. So as we look at the view page here, on the next page here, the example code for the view, we'll see, well, how does hello view get used? All right, so how does it resolve that and figure out which actual JSP page to do? And then hello message. All right, where does that message key come into play? All right. So the name of the view that was returned was hello view. And if you go back to kind of the configuration of that view resolver, and remember the prefix and the suffix that we had there, this is basically the JSP page that it's going to view, and that Spring MVC is going to view basically. All right. So the sample code for the JSP itself. Right. Notice here you have an expression which uses that hello message. Right. So basically all you have to do is grab whatever the value was set for that hello message, and basically that's displayed on the page. Right. Obviously in this code example, we're not really doing too much with hello message. It's pretty much whatever was passed in as the request parameter is just getting passed through to the value for that message. But we could have, looked this up in a database. We could have done a number of things with it. It's just going to be displayed in the view page. So very easy to use. Spring MVC does also have a JSP custom tag library for simplifying forms. Right. And I see here the big thing is the prefix for the tags that you have here. You have form. The first one's kind of confusing. You have form. Right. The first one is the prefix, and the second is the actual form tag. So that's the boundaries of this special input. And then here, form input. A little bit different than a normal HTML input, but basically it's going to link it up to a property of a Java object that's being managed by Spring MVC. So there's lots of other custom JSP tags. It's just a quick example, and just to kind of point out that they're there. That this is something that you can leverage. All right. Here it talks a little bit more about request mapping. Right? Notice that you can have the request mapping annotation either at the class level or the method level. And basically, if you have them at both places, Spring MVC kind of combines the settings to figure out which request should go where. All right? So notice the class level we have request mapping /appointments. So anything in the URL that says /appointments is going to come into this class. Right? And then it's going to look at other details of the request to figure out which request mapping we want to have. Right? Notice you can use the method of the request. So in this case, they're both GET. They could be POST, something like that. Used quite a bit for REST services. And the REST service implementation in Spring is basically based off of this for Spring MVC. Notice here in the second method, you have value equals /day, and that's kind of a placeholder with these curly brackets for day. So if the URL coming in was /appointments and then / for the date, basically, we would call the second method, and the second method would only show appointments for that particular day. And notice another advanced thing that's going on in the second example. This placeholder called day in the request mapping URL, that's the same as the name of the variable. So that's going to initialize that variable. So whatever you pass in the URL with the request that comes in, it's going to initialize, in this case, this date. Notice the path variable annotation. So it's going to link that to that, basically that value coming in from the request URL. Right. So again, some advanced stuff that you can do. Again, obviously this just scratches the surface, right? But there's a lot of stuff, that you can do for multiple requests. As of course, every complex web application is going to have a lot of different requests, so a lot of different things you can do with it. Right. Another common thing that you want to do is to skip the controller part. Just say, well, if you see this kind of request, send them straight to this view. Very common for like the home page of an application. Right, so if you just see in this example just the /, so the idea is if you don't actually say anything, you just put in the host name or something and hit return or whatever. This could be like the home page of the application. It's going to take the name of that view, use the normal view resolvers, and figure out what view to display. So this, in our case, this would probably be like home.jsp, with that view resolver that we had set up. Right? But the advantage here, of course, is the user doesn't need to know that they have to type in home.jsp. Right? They just type in kind of the slash that says, hey, I just want to go to the root of the application, and they'll automatically get routed to the right place. Right? This is actually in Spring configuration file. So it's not actually in Java code. It's just another way to handle and map requests. All right. One of the other things in the kind of the advertisements for the webinar, we talked about a little bit about how Spring MVC is going to integrate with other stuff. We mentioned kind of tiles and JavaScript. Just kind of a quick intro of some of that kind of stuff. Apache Tiles is an open source framework kind of for implementing the design pattern called composite view. The idea that you have different parts of the view and some of them are shared, like a header section or navigation or something like that. Other, like the body of a view, is very unique to whatever the view that is. Right? Tiles used to be actually part of struts, but then it was broken out into a separate open source project. Right? So you can actually use this separately, and this is pretty common with Spring MVC, is just to use this separate tiles project. Right? Big thing in Apache Tiles is we have a template view. We basically have different placeholders for where the actual content is going to be placed. And then to define the actual content of the pages, it actually comes from more of a configuration file. It says, well, if you're displaying page X has got this in the hood, this in the header, this in the body, this in the footer, etc. Right, so it's pretty common. Right. So as far as the code of, let's say, like a JSP page, this is actually a template JSP for tiles. And the big thing here is, notice we have basically tiles custom JSP tags that are going to access things like attributes, right? And we're going to look for sections called like header, content, etc. And the names of these are important because here in a second when we take a look at the definition of the pages, these names are going to be used in that definition file. So it'll say, okay, well, here's the title to use for this page, and I'll substitute that in the template basically. And notice here, as far as the template goes, you have the normal HTML and head, body, some table, tags, etc. So that's definitely all in the template, right, making the content of the page a lot simpler. So now if you want to provide the body of a particular page, well, really all you have to do is provide the content attribute without all of the surrounding HTML and tables and all that kind of stuff. So a very common pattern, and none of this yet is Spring specific. So this is kind of just general tile stuff. Right? So if you look at a tiles definition file, right, here's where you're going to have the different definitions, which basically translate into pages. Right? Notice here you have a link to the template JSP that we saw on the last page. And because this is a template, it's like these are kind of the defaults. Right? So the default header is going to be header.jsp. The default footer is going to be a different request, whatever you get back from .footer. Maybe that's a separate request that's sent to get the content of the footer. Now you have a second definition, added at purchase. This would be an actual, in our Spring MVC case, this would be an actual view that you'd be looking for. Notice that it extends template. And so really all we have to do is say, well, what's different about this particular page? Well, what's different about this particular page is maybe just the title and just the content. So again, a different JSP file for the content, and in this case, this is maybe a key properties file or something for the value of a title. So using something like internationalization. That's pretty common. So now the question is, well, how do we use tiles within Spring MVC? Right, Spring supports Tiles 2, which is kind of the separate tiles project. There are a little bit of requirements as far as exactly what versions. Again, if you're using something like Maven to kind of assemble all the different stuff that you have, it's a lot easier to figure out what versions you're going to need for different stuff. Tiles 1 is kind of the version that was still part of struts that is supported. But again, typically we're using that outside of struts now, so Tiles 2 is definitely more common. Notice here you have a Spring Bean configuration. So this is in your Spring configuration file. Define something called a tiles configurer. And the big thing about the tiles configurer is it's going to look for that definition XML file. So that file that says these are the different pages and this is the content of the page and the title of the page, etc. That's the definitions loaded by Tiles Configurer. So that's what you have. Now for view, okay, of course in that Tiles definition file, the name of the definition is going to be used as a view name in Spring MVC. So to do that integration where Spring MVC you can use basically a view resolver to look for that view, notice there's a Tiles view class. Right? So this is basically kind of a standard Spring MVC view resolver, just kind of switching the implementation of the view itself a little bit to pull this stuff from Tiles. Say, okay, well, if you're going to give me back the view name, add, edit, purchase, or whatever, I'm going to look in that definition file, look for that same name, and that's going to be my view. I'm going to assemble that view from the content of the Tiles definition. All right. So that's one thing you can do, is you can use Tiles in a Spring MVC application. Notice very simple, and really there's not too much that's different with the Spring MVC part of it. You're still returning view names. The only difference is now these view names match the name of a definition in that definition file. Really what you're adding here is pretty much pure Tiles programming. So there's really not too much that's Spring specific besides the configuration here. And of course that's a one-time thing. All right. So how about JavaScript? All right. JavaScript, AJAX, how to integrate with kind of JavaScript is a very popular thing nowadays. And the idea is we want to have kind of complex JavaScript features and functionality without a lot of kind of raw JavaScript code. Right? And there are a lot of frameworks out there to help support that. Spring JavaScript is a framework to kind of simplify that integration between web applications and JavaScript functionality. Right? Now there is a link between Spring JavaScript and Dojo. Right? So that's kind of one of the things that's true there. Spring JavaScript is technically part of the Spring Webflow project. We'll kind of talk about that here in a second, just a little bit. Right? But the good thing is you can include Spring JavaScript in a project without any other Webflow components. So it can still really be just a regular Spring MVC application, and you can just add this just for the JavaScript function, and without any of the Webflow stuff we'll talk about here in a second. But it is important to note that if you look here, this is the Maven dependency that you might use for Spring JavaScript. It does come from the Webflow group. So just don't get confused by that. All right. So again, it is related to Dojo, kind of a layer on top of Dojo, comes packaged with Dojo. Dojo is simply an open source JavaScript library. It gives a lot of good features on top of JavaScript. Gives you lots of nice little widgets that you can put on a web page where you don't have to really write a lot of the complex JavaScript functionality into them. They're already there. Lots of utilities to kind of help you in developing AJAX or JavaScript-based applications. Spring JavaScript jar files. So this is the jar file of the Spring JavaScript project. This is what you're going to be including in your own application that uses it. It already comes packaged with Dojo. Right? Certainly there are ways to use a different version of Dojo, and you just do the normal version. But if it's okay to use the version that comes with Spring JavaScript, a lot easier. You don't have to figure out where to put that in your own project or anything like that. So a lot simpler in terms of the Dojo programming, I think, as well. But you can do that. Spring JavaScript kind of abstracts a lot of those details for using Dojo, really to kind of keep things simple and kind of Spring's form tag library mechanism. Right? So when you use the actual form components, right? So here when it talks about non-web form components, again, other things that are outside of Spring's form tag library, you'd use those with normal Dojo programming. So not a lot of difference. All right. One thing that you would have to do in configuring this to work with kind of a web application, Spring JavaScript web application, is typically you'll configure something called the resource servlet. The resource servlet basically just lets you serve requests for resources, which are often JavaScript source files, basically a lot of times style sheets being served as resources as well. So this is something, notice here that there's a JavaScript resource servlet implementation that's basically built into Spring JavaScript that you can configure. Okay? starting with Spring 3.04, right, so not 3.00, but certainly one of the more recent versions of Spring. There's an even simpler way to do this. Notice they actually added a resources tag to the MVC configuration namespace. Right? So rather than having all of this code in the web.xml part of it up above, you just have the 2 lines down below. Right? But it's still got the same settings basically. It's still got all of the same settings that you saw above. It's just simpler configuration, and it just built into the Spring MVC namespace basically. All right. So now the question is, how do you include Spring JavaScript on individual pages? All right, so you'd have these, basically these scripts, lines of script code basically on any page that you wanted to include. Big thing here is notice that the value, let me erase that, the value here starts with /resources. All right, that's the same thing that's mapped to that resource servlet. Right? So this is how that's all going to link together basically. All right. What comes after that, that mapping could be different if you wanted, but what comes after it, /dojo, /spring, etc., that's going to be standard, because that's basically the included version of Dojo and Spring JavaScript files that they're providing for you and how you get to them. All right. You'd also typically link to a style sheet. Again, notice here the /resources prefix, the resource servlet here, and there are several different style sheets that come with Dojo. Again, a slightly different URL, but they're all in there in the package already. All right. So that's pretty common. Obviously, if you're going to use this on a lot of different pages, if you already have a page template, well, pretty good to put that in the head section of a page template. So that way the body of all of your individual pages doesn't even have to worry about it. They can just use the different functions from Spring JavaScript. Okay. All right. Here it talks about Spring JavaScript decorations. Okay. I think there's tons of examples we can go through, and obviously don't have time, so there's just one. Basically, this example, notice that it's an input field from the normal Spring MVC form tag library. The path is called credit card name. Right? Basically, there's a section here, which is JavaScript, and notice that that's actually after the end of this form tag, so it's a separate thing. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to add a JavaScript validation feature to this input field. Right? And of course, if we're talking about validation, well, we need to make sure that it's got, like 16 digits or something, and make sure they're all numbers, they aren't strings or something like that. So here, notice the big thing here. Yeah, spring.add decoration. Right. So add decoration. This is the kind of custom JavaScript function that Spring JavaScript adds. And notice you give it the element ID credit card name. So this links the two together. So it adds this, basically this validation function, this validation JavaScript function, to the standard form field. All right. So that's basically part of it. And notice here you can add multiple decorations to combine functionality. Again, there's tons of built-in different elements, different things that you can do with it. So it's very common to do this. All right. What I wanted to do is let me open up a poll real quick. Before we get into Spring Webflow, I just want to kind of get some information from you guys. This is a poll question that basically we can get your answer from. Kind of wanted to get some info from you guys on kind of what Java web frameworks you guys basically use in your own applications. So just go to the window for this and just put in your answer. You can put in more than one. So certainly if you use more than one web framework, put them both in. But we're always interested in finding out, what stuff do you guys actually use. Right? So of course that's where we want to focus on all our attention. So do that. Somebody just put in the question section, struts and Spring MVC. Go ahead and just click on it in your window, in the window that you have of showing the webinar. That's the best way to put in your answer there. All right. And what we'll do next, we'll talk about overview of Spring Webflow. Right? So I'll talk about what is Spring Webflow and some of the different things you can do with it. All right. Let me go ahead and close the poll here. Just as expected, looks like Spring MVC is pretty good. Do see struts kind of in front of Java server faces. So that's interesting. So let me go ahead and share the results here real quick. Serverless JSP kind of tied with JSF as well. And certainly serverless JSP without an additional framework. You know, there are tons of frameworks out there now that kind of simplify stuff. So certainly that's one thing that you can work with. All right. So I'll go ahead and hide that and get back to the slides here. Okay. So we'll talk about a little bit about Spring Webflow. Okay. Webflow is the last version of, basically it's, again, a separate open source project. Implements different UI flows for your web application. Typically a flow is used to perform some kind of specific function. So shopping cart checkout, user registration. You know, login is pretty simple, right? But if you had a little bit more complex login process, you might do that. Typically a flow is going to be very useful for anything that has kind of states that you're moving between. All right, so you think about the checkout process. Well, you're getting all the different information that you're collecting on different pages, and you're kind of going through those in a certain sequence. That's kind of the idea of a web flow. We'll kind of see another example of that here in a second. Big difference here with Spring Webflow is these flows are actually defined by an XML file. And even though there are Spring Eclipse tools that help you kind of edit them visually and kind of lay out, step 1, step 2, and see the arrows going between them and everything, it's still XML source code. Right? So what ends up happening is you have this kind of definition for, again, kind of the flow of the application, and each different state of that flow is linked to, in Spring MVC terms, a view, a different view. Right? And here it talks a little bit about the Spring Webflow flow engine. Right? Again, that's not really code that you're writing. That's coming as part of Spring Webflow, and it's just executing basically your flow definitions. Okay? For the sequence of steps that you're providing for navigating in a web application. So Spring Webflow is an extension of Spring MVC. Right? So again, very specific kind of use case typically. Best types of applications for Spring Webflow, clear start and end point. So there's a defined sequence for how things are going to be done. You have to go through a set of screens in a specific order kind of thing. Some of those might be optional, but the idea is that you're generally kind of going through them in a certain case. Another thing, what if you have something that's not finalized until the last step, right? Maybe you're allowing somebody to edit something, and rather than providing all of the details on one big page where they're editing all the different fields, you kind of step them through several different pages and say, okay, well, on page 1 you can edit these properties, page 2 you edit different properties, but nothing's finalized until you get to the end. And they say, commit all the changes or something like that. So that's another good thing for Spring Webflow, because what Webflow can do is it can maintain kind of a temporary version of those changes that are being made. Okay? And that's built into Spring Webflow. You don't have to kind of construct that yourself, but certainly you could do. Right? It's just built into Webflow, very easy. Also, avoiding things like duplicate submissions. Right? What if I refresh the page for submitting my order? Right? Certainly I don't want to submit a second order. I just want to maybe perhaps view the results of my last order that I submitted. Right? So you can avoid that kind of situation. That's a very common thing that you have to worry about in web applications. Right? So it's something you can implement with Spring Webflow. Okay? Again, talks a little bit about Spring MVC. Okay? So Spring Webflow is an extension of Spring MVC. You will still have elements of Spring MVC there. But definitely a lot of the programming is more the Webflow programming. A lot of the configuration is going to be very similar to Spring MVC. But again, that's one-time stuff. Right? So typically with Spring Webflow application, you're concentrating a lot more on the flow definitions. Right? And instead of controllers that you would be using in Spring MVC, you're going to be using these flows, these web flows. Right? You still use the custom JSP tags provided by Spring MVC framework, right? And there are some Spring MVC bean configuration. So again, a lot of that configuration file will be similar. But the big thing is flow definitions instead of actual controller Java classes. So a little bit different. All right. Here it talks a little bit about the Webflow modules. Again, Webflow itself is kind of broken down a little bit as well. Depending on what you need, you can grab some of this or others, other parts of it. You can see that the Webflow 2 module is kind of the core module that you have here. Obviously, that's required by some of the other stuff that you might have here. Again, JavaScript, that's what we just talked about, is the ability to use this even outside of flow definitions and the typical Webflow application. Notice there is a specific integration with JSF and Spring Webflow. So basically, you could use JSF view pages, but have the flow definition of the sequence of steps and everything that's still with the flow definition file. Right? So there's an integration there as well. Here it talks about data binding, right? So kind of data binding with kind of used internally by other modules. You don't use this as much as an end user, right? But it's kind of one of the different modules that you've got. Right. Here it talks a little bit about other integration stuff. Again, tiles, you see that pop up again. Facelets, Trinidad, rich faces, these are all JSF, various JSF libraries and stuff. Dojo, AJAX framework. Right. Velocity and FreeMark are kind of alternatives for view templates. So instead of having JSP pages, instead of having JSF pages, you have other kinds of page template technologies. So there's a lot of different stuff that you can kind of integrate with Spring Webflow as well. All right. Again, coming back to a flow. Flow is kind of a reusable sequence of steps to perform some kind of business function. Again, registering a new user, logging on, checking out, etc. Kind of the same thing as UML state diagrams. And it consists of a sequence of states. These states are going to be rendering views, and you can perform actions. Talks here a little bit about a flow transition. What you can do is you can even add some programming around a flow transition. You can say, okay, well, when we transition from this state to that state, call a method on this Java class, and you can do something like that. So you can get a lot of the same kind of function as you could do with controllers. But it's a lot more seamlessly integrated. The one downside with Spring MVC controllers is it's basically kind of one request at a time. So you still don't have this kind of central, what are all of the requests and how they relate to each other. Right? It's kind of each request at a time. Webflow is a little bit more about how are requests related to each other. Right? So this request is setting up that data, passes it off to the next page, and that sends a second request, which sets up some additional data. So you get a little bit more, kind of better overview of that with the Webflow. Right? Again, flows are using this XML language, and they're flow definition files, which you have here. Don't really have an example of the XML syntax. So I don't want to get too bogged down with that. We'll see kind of a visual representation of a flow definition file. But again, behind the scenes, this is XML. It's basically interpreted by Spring Webflow. Right? And you can also add security. Right? So you can add security for Webflow definitions, kind of define security restrictions as well. Right? So this is kind of a simple example of a Webflow example. Kind of the process here is booking a hotel room or something. Right? So you're kind of getting the information about what you want to reserve. When you submit that, you're going to be taken to a page where you can review that and say, is this the room that you want to reserve or not? You can confirm that or cancel that, right? Again, those are actions that the user is taking to kind of go between these different states, basically. Right? So on this review booking page, there's different buttons. One of them is going to be tied to the confirm transition. The other button is going to be tied to the cancel transition. That's a lot more abstract way to kind of set this up. Once you display, these different pages, the idea is the flow is then going to end, right? So the database work that we need to do to confirm the booking, well, that's going to be part of this confirm commit process. Right? If you cancel it, again, we're just going to kind of throw away the data that was stored temporarily, perhaps, and just show you a page that says, okay, we've canceled your reservation. Right? So you have something like that. Because the flow ends at this point, one thing that's important, if the user were to say like refresh their page or hit the back button or something like that, basically you can set up this flow so that it basically takes you back to the starting point, right? Or maybe they picked a certain part in their history where they're not really allowed to view that state anymore because they're not in that state. They're kind of moved out of that state. So Webflow can automatically handle that kind of stuff, right? So you won't be able to kind of hit the back button and accidentally confirm it when you thought you'd cancel it. So Webflow can automatically do that kind of thing. So that's one of the benefits of Webflow that we have. Right. Big benefit here, of course, we have kind of central definition of the flow of the web application. So again, unlike Spring MVC, where it's kind of spread out across all these different controllers, right? Here we have a more centralized, a little bit more centralized what the steps are. The Webflow approach is kind of a standardized approach for defining that flow, and the idea is that that's independent of what the views look like. So kind of the look and feel and the views and what's on the views, that's independent of kind of the navigation. And the navigation is kind of abstracted away into this flow definition, right? And then the views can do anything they want, right? They could provide a link for that, they could provide a button, however they want to do it, right? All right. Big thing that I think it talks about here is, again, it highlights how Spring MVC, you have lots of different controller classes, right? So it might be hard to kind of look at a complex Spring MVC application and really get a feel for how all the requests tie together, right? Because they're much more individualized. So Spring Webflow, definitely one of the benefits, much more kind of central definition of what's happening. You can also have multiple Webflow definitions, and these can be defined to be self-contained. The idea is we could reuse that confirmation process or the checkout process or something like that, maybe in different applications, different parts of an application. All right, so you can kind of break this down, and basically the entire module is kind of a separate piece. All right, so maybe there are lots of different places that can send you through the checkout process. Right, you don't have to define them each individually, just have them all kind of point to, here's how we go through the checkout process. So much more modular for the several requests tied together for that kind of function. All right. So to kind of wrap up, just want to mention real quick some of the things we have to offer as far as Spring 3 goes. We do have a special section in our website specifically for Spring 3 applications. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to start putting them in the question section. I'll go through those here in a second. As far as the different training classes we have a ton of different options. There are a number of different class types that we have. Core Spring is a pretty common class, pretty popular class. Covers a lot of different options. Focuses a little bit on the web stuff, kind of the basic Spring dependency injection, this kind of thing. We do have a kind of web-focused outline that we're probably going to be even expanding on a little bit here in the next couple of months. Focuses a little bit more on web technologies. So we kind of know the basics of Spring and dependency injection. Just want to kind of get an idea of what's the web stuff that I can do with it nowadays. That might be a good one to do. Okay. We also have some classes that are focusing more on Spring with other Java EE standards. So rather than Spring MVC, if you have JSF web applications, you use JPA for persistence. We show kind of how to do Spring with those standards, since that's very common. This kind of replaces like the Spring Hibernate classes that we've had in the past. Because typically Hibernate was used for persistence. Nowadays JPA is replacing that. That's a more standardized way to do basically the same thing. So now we have Spring JPA JSF kind of classes that show that. If you're already familiar with Spring and just want to focus on the new features, we do have a Spring migration and new features class. So that's a good one that only focuses on the differences. So that's one thing that you can take a look at. One of the things that really I think makes our Spring classes unique, we do have Spring classes with WebSphere, right? Very common that people use WebSphere for the server, but Spring for the application framework, right? And showing that particular combination is pretty important. There are a couple places in different chapters where we focus on, maybe this is something you have to do a little bit different in WebSphere or something. So focus on that a little bit. And so try and kind of pass that along. And of course, the benefit of that is also that the lab environment that you have for those training classes is WebSphere, right? WebSphere with Spring. Right? Big principle of these Spring 3 classes, again, using the features of Spring 3. So annotations, simpler configuration, all the stuff that's new, really focus on that in these classes. And so that's what we have. One thing that also makes our training unique is this, with Spring 3, we're starting to use Spring tools with Eclipse. We have offered RAD classes in the past, but really nowadays it's easier to do Spring for WebSphere with Eclipse, because a lot of people aren't familiar with this yet, but IBM's actually released free tools for Eclipse for WebSphere. So all the things that you used to have to do with RAD, which is kind of deploy to WebSphere and start and stop the server, all that kind of stuff, or you had to do manually, right? Those are out now built into these free Eclipse plugins that you can get and add to Eclipse. So this has been very popular in our Spring classes because, again, Spring provides its own Eclipse tools as well, and it's really easy to integrate those together with Eclipse. It's kind of hard to get the Spring tools and RAD to work together because they both update in different ways. But WebSphere tools, Spring tools, and Eclipse, great fit. So we're doing that. Won't get into too much of the detail, but if you want some more information about this, I have a link here to the blog post that I posted a while ago that explains it. Okay. So when you download this presentation, just go ahead and jump to that blog post, and it'll provide you the details and everything. But this has been very popular in our Spring classes, like I say, is using WebSphere, Spring, and Eclipse. So that's one thing that I think makes us unique as well. All right. So again, if you have any questions, put in the questions section. Just in summary, Spring MVC, powerful framework for web applications. Annotations, we saw a couple different places in Spring MVC 3 that make programming very simple. All right. Spring MVC can integrate with a lot of different kinds of technologies. We kind of showed tiles and JavaScript. All right. Certainly there are others that are out there that you can dive into. Spring itself has a framework and integrate into other stuff, so a lot of this integration may not come from MVC specifically, but just Spring in general. And then finally, Spring Webflow. So just kind of a peek for kind of what you can do with Spring Webflow, how it extends Spring MVC, and kind of the multi-step web applications that it's really geared to. All right. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email as well. I have our contact information there as well. If you want Spring information, springsource.org is pretty much the main place to do it. And otherwise, I'll go ahead and answer questions. All right. So one question we had, does Spring Webflow have controls for handling duplicate flows in the same user session? It does. And basically, that's something that you can pretty easily basically avoid. All right, because what Spring Webflow does is it tracks basically where you are in the flow itself. So the idea is if say I'm on the final page of a checkout process, right, and I submit that form, and that's charging my account, creating the order, all that kind of stuff, right? Webflow remembers that you've transitioned to the next step where that's done and you're showing the confirmation page, right? So if I were to go back or hit refresh or something, it will remember, hey, you're not on that step anymore, right? So you can actually do that. So it does remember that kind of stuff, right? Spring MVC with jQuery integration, haven't really investigated that a whole lot. Like I mentioned, we're going to try and expand the Spring Web class, and that's something we're going to do in the next couple of months. I think that is definitely an area where there's a lot of interest, because certainly when you talk about Spring JavaScript, well, jQuery has become pretty popular with JavaScript as well. So I don't really have any info on that specifically, but I'm imagining that's going to be part of our class, part of our Spring Web class here a little bit. All right. Here another question, kind of double-click, submitting twice Spring MVC control. Again, there is ways to basically build that into us. I don't know a Spring MVC part of it, right? Spring Webflow there is, right, like I mentioned. Spring MVC, the problem with that basically is Spring MVC doesn't have the concept of, you're moving between different states in the application, right? So Spring MVC doesn't really have anything built in to handle that situation, whereas Webflow does, right? So that'll be a little bit different. Here's a good question: why Spring MVC over Struts 2? Really depends a little bit. I think one thing that's true about Struts 2, it'd be nice if Struts 2 had been out earlier, I think they kind of focused a little bit too much on, well, let's not wait, let's not figure out what's next for Struts 2, and Spring MVC took over a little bit. They're both similar in terms of more normal Java code and annotations and this kind of thing. Obviously, Spring MVC integrates with Spring better, right? So you can do basically a lot of the same kind of things. But again, the same concept, model view controller, and so it's really different. I would say if you already have a Struts application, one thing that's true is moving to Struts 2 is a pretty big difference. All right, so it's not just like the next minor version of Struts. It is a pretty big difference. So really going from Struts 1 to Struts 2 or Struts 1 to Spring MVC, right? A lot of the terms are going to be similar, Struts 1 to Struts 2, but a lot of it is still pretty different. And so I don't think there's going to be a difference in terms of what you need to figure out between the two. Maybe a little bit less barrier to adopting Struts 2 as opposed to Spring MVC. But again, I don't know the difference between them. I don't know if I've ever seen a specific comparison of the two, right? But again, there's a lot of different changes. I think Spring Webflow, kind of as an extension, I would certainly list that as a benefit of Spring MVC compared to Struts 2, right? So that might be one thing in the favor of Spring MVC. Struts 2, again, of course, like I say, the history, maybe a little bit closer to what you're familiar with Struts 1. So there's a couple different motivations for it. All right. Any other questions? Put them in the questions section. All right, other than that, thank you guys very much. Looks like you don't have any other questions. Go ahead and look for our next webinars coming up, and we'll see how you guys do. All right, thanks a lot.